Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I am so excited to be here today, along with my co-host and our expert panel. Welcome to Black Health Now, hosted by DDB Health. The title of our event is Food for Thoughtful Change, and I have the honor of introducing our panelists and giving a bit of background on why we are here today. When we began putting together our Black Health Now event, we spoke about type 2 diabetes as a disease, but shifted our thinking to think of it more as a symptom. And then if we thought of it as a symptom, what was the real disease? And we found that food inequity was one of the main diseases that we wanted to focus on today. So I am so excited for us to be joined by Tamara, Daryl, and Mark. I'm going to give you a bit of background on them and read their impressive bio. So excuse me while I read a bit, but really want you to know who we have with us today. Tamara Stevenson, MPH and MA, is the founder and CEO of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, with a mission of building a movement of Black women and girls to educate, advocate, and innovate the food systems from farm to health. She is also a PhD candidate at the American University School of Communication, with experience focused on critical approaches to structural communication inequalities that affect under-resourced communities about food and health inequities. Tamara, we are so excited to have you with us today. Daryl Harris is a PhD and MA, and he is at the inaugural Cynthia and Robert S. Lawrence Fellow at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. A little bit of a tongue twister there, Daryl, to kick off. He is working to advance CLF's mission to join the next generation of leaders working to improve food systems with a focus on neighborhood-related health factors, social determinants of health, and community-based participatory research. And Mark Winnie has worked for over 50 years as a community food activist, writer, and trainer. From organizing breakfast programs for low-income children in Maine to developing innovative national policies in Washington, D.C., Winnie has dedicated his professional life and writing to enabling people to find solutions to their own food problems, as well as those that face their communities and the world. Mark holds a bachelor's degree from Bates College and a master's degree from Southern New Hampshire University. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to everyone listening. We are so excited to have you here, and I have the honor of passing this to my colleague, Nikki, who will help moderate today's panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As everyone can tell, we have really an excellent amount of expertise that we really want to share and talk to these folks this morning and get a perspective on food for thoughtful change. So for starters, T2D and other cardiorenal metabolic conditions are extremely prevalent in Black communities. And we wanted to talk about the historical context. Looking back, how has policy influence the culture of food and health of Black communities, particularly as that relates to diet-related health conditions such as type 2 diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and heart failure? Anyone want to kick us off with that?
Give it a shot. I'll start off.
Sure.
Unless you want to go ahead, Daryl.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. I maybe because I'm the oldest person on the panel, I do have this sort of historic perspective, which, if you were to answer the question very succinctly, I think you'd have to say racism and poverty are very much behind a lot of what we face today in terms of Black health. And I would add many of the dietary related health problems of Americans. I think, what I've had the advantage of seeing during the course of my work has been communities that have gone from being relatively well served by affordable, healthy food stores, and they carried adequate supplies of good, healthy food, to communities that were completely absent of those kinds of stores. I had the distinct, really opportunity to work in Hartford, Connecticut for 25 years as a community organizer and activist, and I saw the community go literally downhill in terms of poverty, and can be completely abandoned by the supermarket industry. I think that we'd have to say, add to racism and poverty, I would say the redlining of Black communities and also more generally communities of color in urban America, and that has been a major pattern. I don't think policy, if we think of that as a government intervention, has kept up with that. I think it has, largely, been absence of policy, meaning the absence of any action, which in fact is a form of policy, I would argue, to address any of those problems. And we've continually failed, and we've continually tried to catch up over time with other interventions, which I know we'll talk about. But I think just from a purely historical background, we've seen largely a failure of policy. We've seen racism and poverty be really sort of the ultimate causes, and that we have seen some good examples of progress being made to address the health, the diet related issues around in the Black communities. So I would say that would be my sort of opening statement about this.
I'll chime in. I'll say, Mark, I'm glad you went first. That was an excellent summary. I'll add on by saying that the effect of the racism, the redlining, the long-term effect of that is that you have communities where essentially you have clustered poverty. And so, and because you have clustered poverty, not only are grocery stores not finding it or not viewing it as a viable place to do business, but many commercial stores are finding it as a non-viable place to do business. And so it becomes a economic vacuum or void in those places, except for vices. Vices seem to thrive, but outside of vices, it's not a place where mainstream businesses want to situate themselves.
So, related to, we've started to touch on this already. A term we wanted to talk about is food justice, and how does that intersect with racial justice, which I think is something that both Dario, you and Mark have just touched on, but a little more about that terminology, food justice. Or Tamara, if you have anything you want to jump
Tamara, do you want to jump on?
Problem. Thank you for the conversation today, and it's great to be in dialogue. As mentioned, I'm temporary Stevenson with Wanda, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., though I hail from the great state of Oklahoma. What I've been able to see, just to bring it local, currently I serve on our D.C. Food Policy Council, and when we see the term food justice at the time coming about, thinking grassroots, bottoms-up approach about addressing these issues, as my colleagues have already highlighted, have come from a top-down approach when you think about policy, and how do these two elements come together in acknowledging power to the people? How does the policy begin listening to the hearts and minds and souls of folks who see among their own community? My home right now is in Anacostia in Ward 8, which becomes a case study of what food apartheid looks like, of structural inequality due to natural borders like the Anacostia River, due to historical redlining, due to historical nature of racism, which is birthed out of the DMV area, if you look back at the Bacon's Rebellion. And so this idea of food justice becomes a matter of, in the midst of the UN Human Rights Day just passing on December 10th, how do we have a right to food being codified and put into law, put into the Farm Bill, to acknowledge that if we need to begin to see oneself as truly as a democracy, as a superpower, as a model for other communities and countries, how do we begin to unlock those possibilities, such as not subsidizing corn, soybean, begin subsidizing specialty crops, begin looking at policies that lock out African Americans in the dietetics profession, that creates financial hardship, to make sure that we have food freedoms on the front line of a profession that claims to improve the health and nutrition of communities, to begin to look at the curriculum that does not reflect our cultural food practices and see that you've been demonizing and omitting and marginalizing not only people, but the very food that has sustained them as a generation, as a culture, and then not having them have a seat at the table to be able to give voice to power around what food justice begins looking like, and showing up in the media as talking heads, policy wonks, and having them in essence speak to what their lived experience is, as what the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health did last year, but also continue to elevate and beat that drum and make sure that everyone has a voice at the table. To me, that's what justice looks like.
Great. So we've touched a couple of times on public policy. This is obviously going to be a really important part of this conversation. Mark, I would love for you to talk a little bit more, just to level set sort of a definition. What is public policy? And what is its role in helping to address food justice or food injustice?
Sure. To me, public policy is fairly simple. It's an expression of who we are as a people. It's an expression of our values. When people, we can talk about it as law, we can talk about it as regulation, we can talk about it from, what has the president said today? I mean, that is all policy. And policy also is the actions, not just of the national or federal government, but it's also local, state, tribal. And I think we can also say there's policy that comes out of large institutions, healthcare institutions, for instance, and universities all have their forms of policy. These are their official actions that they take or their positions that they subscribe to, but ultimately they derive from the idea of values. And if we, as I said at the beginning, if we don't value health, and if we don't value it through the lens of justice, which means that everybody, regardless of who they are, has equal access.
Yeah.
All right. Going to give Mark a moment to come back, but I know that Mark, he's not the only one that has talked a little bit about public policy and how it can be utilized to address some of the food justice. And I think Daryl, you may have been the one that mentioned it's not just policy, but the absence of policy as well, that is sort of a policy in and of itself.
Yeah, I think Mark actually said that, but yeah, the idea is that policy is telling people what they can do. The absence of policy is also, it's not, when policy is not enacted in the proper way, then people don't get the services they need. Cities don't get the services they need. Or as Tambra was talking about, like the right food items are not subsidized, and you need policy to try to get and to encourage people, to force people sometimes to act in a way that is beneficial to most people.
Got it. Mark, welcome back. We can't hear you.
I think you're muted.
But I think it's an easy solve. Should be able to unmute. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
All right.
I'm sorry about that.
So if you have anything else to add on public,
I just want to emphasize, I know Dario was gladly filling in my blanks, but I was trying to make the point that, we are a capitalist system, and I don't want to rant about, the economics necessarily, but I do want to point out that, it's only policy, it is only public policy, honestly, where we can make the corrections of the failure of the marketplace to serve everybody fairly and to serve everybody justly. And there's no other place to go to make that happen. So that's why public policy is so critical, so important, when we're considering a question as enormous as Black health.
Okay. So moving on to, how we can start to solve some of this. Obviously policy is an incredibly important part of it, but Tambra, would love to hear from you a little bit on what you feel is the role of food education in health and in Black health in particular.
So being an educated consumer in the food system is fundamentally important in order to make decisions around what it means to nourish oneself and to produce a healthy, productive economy. And so I want to first have people everywhere to see themselves as food citizens. And to be a food citizen, what does that mean? To have full participation in civic engagement in a democracy. And we've not really had that momentum build up. And so even here at our DC Food Policy Council, we have a meeting actually this week around setting our priorities for the new year. And the Nutrition and Health Working Group that I sit on, our emphasis will be focused on education. How do we build a network of those who are nutrition educators? They may not have seen themselves as a collective, as part of an industry that's so critical. But when you think about pharmaceutical sales, they see themselves as educators to doctors to make decisions around purchasing medication for their patients to be healthy. Well, I see food in no difference. How do we educate not only those in the profession, but those who also serve as consumer base, as citizens around educating themselves? And so that means first begin, how can policy unlock creating a more democratized education around food? Right now, we have a disparity here in DC where one side of the river has more garden nutrition education programs in schools compared to my own community. When you think about DC Health and the role that they play and legislation that can be created to make sure that not only do we have universal school meals, we need to have universal school nutrition education. And that means producing the reports, showing the data, providing that insight, because ultimately when you make that investment for every dollar in nutrition, you get a $16 return. The UN says this. So why are we not understanding this basic fundamental understanding about the importance of a whole child education? CDC talks about this. This is why USDA ensured that we have local wellness policies in place, making that mandatory if you're going to receive USDA funding. And so this is how the role that policy can play, is cutting through the red tape, creating an equal playing field, enabling environments where everyone thrives and not just some. And so that's why entrepreneurship is great, but it will not solve the problem of the whole people. That's the role that government does. And that's why policy from a public policy perspective is so critical that Mark highlighted. And it does go back to what are our values? Do we care about our children? Do we care about healthy families? And that means investing in making sure that we have an informed proletariat to make sure that when they go to the polls, they're making informed decisions and have representatives that speak on their behalf.
And related to that, what are some of the structural challenges that are faced by these Black communities that we're talking about, these particularly vulnerable communities?
Yeah, we some were touched on it when we talked about redlining, but I will also say what I've been able to see on the ground here is covenant clauses that I hadn't had the fortune to know before. But when you think about the number of grocery stores in a community, someone would say, well, why don't we have more grocery stores? And it's not as easy, especially when you have lobbyists, paying to play in a marketplace to ensure that they lock out competition. And when you have these decisions being made when it comes to something that we need to survive, that is an ethical, moral dilemma. And unfortunately, that has played out in areas where we have food apartheid. And this is important to know, because when we have stores that say we're committed to come to a community and then they pull out once they get the locations that they want in upper parts of Northwest, but leave Southeast hanging, that's a problem. And so that's why it's such a problem to see food from a perspective of capitalism, when you literally need food to live. And it's not enough to rely just on food banks. If anything, food banks understand that they are a temporary Band-Aid solution, that ultimately we have to address the root cause of the problem. When we allow expired food to be served in our communities, which, having been a garden nutrition educator at Harriet Tubman, I've seen it with my own 2 eyes, that's a problem too. Because who else is eating expired food? Yes, we talk about the sell by date may not be accurate or whatever, but are you eating expired food? That's the question we should be asking. So we have a list of reasons of why we have structural problems of how we think and value all of humanity, and saying that some communities can do without, or do with very little, or do with poor quality. Even the grocery stores with the same brand in one side of DC will have the same stores on my side offer poor quality food, until the drum was beaten and put in front of media and policymakers and show, are you allowing this to happen under your watch? Things begin changing. So it's so many layers to this that I've been able to see, and down even to farmers markets, we don't have equal access, more on one side than the other. Even when we do, the same vendors are not there. The price tag may be higher. You may not have the same access. And so that's why it's so important to have these conversations to create the discourse in order to begin thinking about how does policy begin solving these problems.
So something that you've sort of touched on, I would actually love to hear a little bit from you, Daryl, on this. We've talked about the term, the absence of the availability of food, but I know something of certain types of healthier food. I know something that you've often talked about is also, not just the scarcity of the healthy food, but the prevalence of the other end of the spectrum. And terms that we often hear are food desert. What is a food desert, but also, what is a food swamp? And the juxtaposition of these two different types of circumstances, is that what's leading to the prevalence of some of these food and related health conditions, these CRM, we call them CRM conditions, cardiorenal and metabolic conditions?
Right. So the term food desert is it's a term it's been around for a while. It's kind of come into disfavor now. But the term essentially was describing an area where there's a scarcity of healthy food, healthy whole foods, right? So if I want greens, if I want fruits, brown rice, sweet potatoes, things that are going to be really nourishing to my body, there's a void there. So Tamara's been using the term food apartheid. And so Karen Washington out of New York, she didn't like the term food desert. A lot of people didn't like the term food desert. Malik Yakini out of Detroit, a lot of people felt that the term food desert suggested that it was natural, suggested that it was something that was, unavoidable. And so the term food apartheid was kind of embraced because it was to show that it was a political, there's a political dynamic in it. And so these are the results of human actions and not the results of just nature. And so a food desert or a food apartheid, or you could say healthy food, there's a place where there's a void of healthy foods, and healthy food access is drastically diminished. And so there's also a term called food swap. And so if you hear about a food apartheid, a food desert, a person may think that there's just no food there, right? So this neighborhood doesn't have any food. And but that's incorrect. And so usually this food desert, food apartheid is also combined with something we call a food swamp, which is to say that there's a dearth of healthy food, but there's a plethora of unhealthy foods. And so if I want fried food carryouts, if I want high salt, high fat like Chinese food, if I want all these food that dietitians tell us to avoid, you can get it, one on top of the other, on top of the other, all these vices, you can get them without any, they're everywhere. But what you cannot get are the things that are life sustaining. And so that's the food. So then the question you asked was, well, are these things contributing to these chronic, metabolic conditions in Black communities? And it's like, absolutely. I'm not sure if it's not the only factor, but it's a strong factor. It's a strong factor. And if there's better food in these areas, combined with, proper education and so forth, then people could actually utilize the better food, and then they would be healthier. We'd be healthier people.
So it sounds like the words that we choose to describe the problems are really critical, because otherwise we sort of miss the point. I think you made a really interesting point that a food desert, and frankly, even to a certain degree, food swamp, it implies that this is something that's naturally occurring, which means maybe we don't have much power to, we didn't create it, so we don't have the power to solve it. Whereas a term such as food apartheid really, frankly, very frankly, addresses that this is a problem that has been created. It speaks obviously to the injustice. So really using the right words to talk about these things, it seems like a
Yeah.
very critical way to get the discourse going in the right direction to find solutions.
It is. And one other thing that it denotes is that the discrimination is only on one side, right? And so when we talk about the food apartheid area, where it's the Black area that's under the apartheid. And so um non in a if a Black area gets a grocery store, 99% of the patrons are going to be Black people. If a white area gets a grocery store, it's going to be visited by everybody, not just white people, right? So Black people are going to go over there and they're going to spend money over there. But historically, white people have been reluctant to come into Black neighborhoods and to spend money at a grocery store in the Black community, which obviously hurts that grocery store, right? I mean, people will drive 30 miles, maybe 30. People will drive far out their way rather than go to the place that's up the street, that happens to be an area that is predominantly Black.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking about now is really resonating with our audience. People commenting that a food swamp is a new term to them. And also, I'm going to read this one, but a social entrepreneur who implemented a food co-op in the South Bronx. And Tamara, I think this speaks kind of to what you were saying. Retail economics wasn't so much the issue as the time needed to educate and engage the community to really keep this going. So I think what you're saying is something that people who are logging in have seen kind of in practice.
Yeah, and that question of the need for greater education, Tamara, you've touched on that. And also, Daryl, I know you're passionate about how all of these circumstances, the scarcity of the healthier food, the prevalence of the less healthy food, the potentially the lack of education, around the fact that these circumstances really exist. This tends to normalize certain types of eating habits, right? And I know that that's something that you've talked about, and reinforcing these, the prevalence and helping to increase, unfortunately, the prevalence of some of these CRM conditions, by normalizing these certain types of eating habits. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. My PhD is in health communications. And so when I started studying at Hopkins, I thought that I could go into whatever area and educate the people enough such that they would make better decisions. And then after campaign after campaign, I realized that this is not the case. And so oftentimes once norms are become established, like people kind of fall into whatever the normal pattern is. And so I began to adjust my communication, not just simply to the end user, although that's still important, but to the people who have more control over the conditions in the first place. And so if we can normalize healthiness, then more people will adapt to it naturally without it being so much a conscious decision. It'll just be this is just what we do here.
Mm. So speaking of normalizing things, Mark, a question for you, and of course, anyone else can feel free to jump in. How does the media portrayal of Black health impact government policy? What we see in the media, what is normalized in the media, and also how does it impact the prevalence of these conditions subsequently?
I think you might be on mute, Mark.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah, there's many factors, and I think just to try to integrate some of the conversation so far. It's if we look at, say, what are some of the structural problems we have, and it begins to also bring in both policy and what is actually going on in any given community. And then what is Dariel is saying, what are some of the norms? And a couple of communities where I've done some work recently, come to mind. And one is Paterson, New Jersey, which town of 150,000 people, and largely a community, a city of color. And people, just as Dariel said, people in that community will be shopping in the suburbs because, as they say, and they told me very directly, they will not eat food from Paterson. They feel that it's substandard. But at the same time, you certainly won't see white people from the nearby suburbs coming into Paterson to shop. That points to sort of the structural failure of these communities. Sometimes it's public transportation. Other times it's the failure of the school system that has taken. And Paterson itself has been on the brink of being taken over by the state of New Jersey at different points. So just because of the failure of their, but again, a failure that goes back both to racism, poverty, a lack of other resources. And so I think too often this leads to a very negative impression that is conveyed by the media, that these are communities that have failed, or that in fact these people have failed, or that their political leadership has failed, when in fact they're just struggling in the most, sometimes under very desperate circumstances, to kind of keep their cities afloat, or just to meet the most basic human services, human needs. And we often, this often plays into the political realm at the same time, so that what is the first thing that the conservative political forces will want to cut when the budget is tight? They always go to food stamps. They always go to SNAP. We want to cut that for whatever reason. I think partly out of their own, sense that their own historic racism, but I think also because they see the media has created this very poor image, very negative image of urban America, of lower income communities, of communities of color, and that are too often associated with certain acts of public policy. In this case, I'm using the example of SNAP. So I think that is part of the problem that we face, is that kind of negative image making, which may be more intentional than we think, not just accidental.
Yeah. Bell Hooks writes that the media portrayal of Black people is always and only unloving. And she points to the movie Soul Food as an example, because in Soul Food, the lady, the grandmother dies of diabetes, essentially. And then the family has a family gathering of the same food that led to the diabetes condition, right? And so Bell Hooks is a Black philosopher on love, and Soul Food is a movie that was written, created by Black people. But it's interesting to bring it up in this conversation because it's about food. And so the portrayal is that, the media portrayal is not positive when it comes to Black faces, and as it is not positive, what ends up happening is that non-Black people view Black people, and sometimes Black people view what we view ourselves as less deserving or as less quality, which then it reinforces the idea that businesses that have standards of quality, of Panera Bread, at Star, these things where they say, our brand is fresh, our brand is, healthy. They're afraid to enter into these spaces because the portrayal of these spaces is detrimental and substandard, almost less deserving.
Is there a feeling that entering into these spaces, to your point, are you suggesting that it would sort of be detrimental to the brand of some of these places, or that they would not be successful from a retail business perspective?
I think it's both. I think it's detrimental to their brand. I mean, I read an article recently about Target moving out of a few urban areas, and they just
Yeah.
happened to be all Black areas. And then there was a Target in Baltimore City that left Baltimore City, and that the Baltimore City Target was profitable. I mean, there's two. There's one in Baltimore, the Target on the uh white side of town is still there, but the Target that was on the Black side of town it left, and it was profitable. It was more profitable than the county Target, but I think it was something to do with the brand and something to do with the experience of customers, and so they decided to shut down. And so I think it's two. This lack of success, but then even if it is successful, there's like, well, is it the same experience as the other place? And we don't want to have people commenting on bad experiences, and so we're gonna vacate this area.
I'd like to offer up just another a spin on that, which I think is consistent with what we're saying, is that you know, increasingly the expectation in some of these many communities that have been more or less abandoned by major chain operations, whether it's food or another product line, is that that community now has to come up with something themselves. They have to come up with a food co-op, or they have to some sort of self-organized approach to meeting their own needs, which is, as a white person living in, say, a suburban area, that's not something I have to worry about. I don't have to worry about trying to create my own, shopping space. It's there. Because those conventional supermarkets, for instance, are just looking, frankly, at the bottom line. And I get one illustration I'd like to offer is a new food co-op that just opened in Dorchester, part of Boston. It's a community of 125,000 people, and about 40% are African American. And it just opened in October. It took them 14 years in order to open that store. A heck of a lot of organizing work without a lot of public policy support. And I'll just want to read the mission statement of the Dorchester Food Co-op. It says, to challenge the traditional food system by building a community and worker-owned asset that nourishes, employs, and reinvests in the local community. That's not the mission statement of our conventional food system. That's not the mission statement of any of your major chain supermarkets. And that's a very dramatic difference in my estimation. And I would not be expecting, that kind of effort to organize a food co-op in your middle class, upper income, largely white communities in America.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Shifting gears a little bit, Tambra, can you talk about what makes the perspective of Black women in this whole situation unique, and how they may be positioned to empower future generations?
So the work of Wanda, which was built out of many different pain points to create this purpose of how do we transform everyday women into food heroes, came with a Black woman being the teacher of my daughter at the time, who was 4, who had her first cavity in fall semester. Up until then, no dental problems, and she didn't see a problem giving junk food as rewards to the children, but yet in question, she didn't see that happening to her own children at another school. And so it was just a glaring example of how you can have, even in our own communities, we're not monolithic. We have historical dimensions of Black bourgeoisie, classism, colorism that creates divisions even in our own community that's not always talked about in mainstream. And therefore, internalized oppression can also have Black folks' willpower against Black people, unintentionally or intentionally. And I say it because it became a critical part of having this idea of how do we get women to see themselves as a fierce food freedom fighting front line against this food fight that is playing out in our communities, because food becomes just a metaphor to see all these things that are weaponized in our communities. Having a grandmother, both grandmothers, which I've written about in my Eating Well piece at the top of the year on African Heritage Diet as Medicine, and in my TED Talk, I like to talk about these issues of diabetes through their lens, because we had to, living in Northeast Oklahoma City, just within a mile of one another. One is still living, was a pediatric geriatric nurse for 35 years at OU Medical, overcame stroke, lived past her husbands, 3 of them, my father, who's deceased, and at age 96, still living and able to be cognizant, coherent, and engage with community affairs. Yet my other grandmother, dying from complications of diabetes, sedentary lifestyle, was a smoker, had childhood trauma, and self-medicated with sweets, loved her desserts. But yet she fell to the demise of all the things that we're talking about today. And so it's through them and uplifting their voices of like, how do we change how we see ourselves when others, because of post-emancipation, there was this belief that Black people were inferior. And so everything that has happened, the portrayal of us in media, the use of policy is all to reinforce this idea that we are undeserving. We will naturally die off because we are inferior, and therefore we do not deserve quality life of anything, from housing to food to accurate portrayals that shows the depth and breadth of who we are as a people. And so that is why, even in my pursuit of education, I decided a PhD in nutrition was not going to do the job. It was clear to me that a PhD in media tech democracy was critical in understanding these structural dimensions, and understanding that even though we're having a conversation about the role of traditional media and marketing, and not even showing health food advertisements in Black magazines and Black media, is also part of the problem of reinforcing our inability to pay, or believing we will not pay for healthy food, which that throws all notions out the window when we see what digital media has done. When you remove the gatekeepers and you inform and influence through grassroots activism, digital food activism, of showing that actually our food is deserving. We have people who see themselves as digital warriors with YouTube videos and channels and Instagram and Facebook and all the TikTok influencers out there like Keith Lee and others, who are showing that we are out here. Our communities are worth deserving of investment, and we will invest in ourselves and change the narrative. And that's what I believe the work of Wanda is doing, is changing the narrative, seeing women as the queens and queens of goddesses, as we are, our ancestors are, while we even brought to this land to be the labor of agriculture and creating this food system that we've helped build, that was highlighted in High in the Hog. And we will reclaim that power, we will return to our roots, and we will restore our health when we understand that.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion with the 3 of you. I'm sure we could do another 1 to 2 hours if we only had the time. Really appreciate the diverse perspectives that you all bring. Obviously, you've spent a tremendous amount of time and passion trying to work to talk about these problems, help solve them, and elevate the conversation. Are there any last thoughts you want to share before we move on to any questions that we may have?
I want anyone who's tuning in to go to iamwanda.org, sign up to our newsletter. We need folks to be in support of a Food Bill of Rights, to be able to understand that this is a framework that our food policy councils can use, that our federal policies can use, which are fragmented, spreading across 50 agencies that are touching food at some point, and to understand that in honor of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we have to believe and recognize that right to food, right to health are fundamental to human decency and compassion, and ensuring that we have a healthy proletariat and democracy. And if we do not believe these things and hold these truths to be self-evident in terms of our value-based system, then we will continue to spirally down, continue to increase obesity numbers, diabetes numbers, heart disease numbers, and we will continue to plummet as an economy that will be outsourced, and labor force will be outsourced. And so when you don't invest in your people, any business understands that. You understand what the return on investment will be: none. So we need to change that system, and we need to support those who are part of this platform today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. I think that's turning just us listening here and all our viewers into action and what they can do. So we will make sure that the link also can go out to the greater Omnicom group that's listening here today. And there are a few questions in the chat that I will read out. The first one is, how do you think today's real estate market plays a role in the lack of grocery stores in, the word here that was used was food deserts? Daryl, do you want to kick us off, or Mark?
I mean, it's hard to say because it's geography dependent, right? So, you know, the market in Baltimore is different from the market in DC, different from the market in some other place. But for sure it's gonna be, for sure it's gonna be a factor. I think one of the things that I've been pushing for local municipalities to kind of decluster poverty. And so oftentimes when the city, like when they run into city issues, or a population of the city that needs to be housed somewhere, they put them into already stressed areas. And so I'm saying, well, why are we putting people into already stressed areas? Let's spread the stress so it's not overwhelming any one population. In other parts of, around America, there are apartment complexes popping up all over the place that are really nice and extravagant, but you have to make $150,000 a year to actually be able to afford it. And so, but these areas shouldn't be exclusively for the ultra wealthy or for the wealthy. There should be cutouts in new apartment complexes and new condos, essentially, for low to moderate income residents, so that we can begin to decluster the poverty, which is declustering the problem.
I like that. Decluster the poverty, which decluster the problem. Mark or Tamara, anything to add on to that?
I think the only thing I think the value, the rents, the value of property, all those things that real estate embodies, they have. It certainly, it was a good question, and it's one that we need to pay attention to. I don't think it's like necessarily the be all and end all when it comes to making decisions about where to locate a supermarket, or to develop a new food store, even a food co-op. I mean, I do know that in the case of Dorchester that I cited earlier, the cost of rent, being able to get access to the right kind of property was certainly a challenge for them, but they were able to overcome it. But I think that, when it comes to the area, again, of public policy, I think public policy has to be looking at the price of rents and the, in providing adequate housing for people at the same time that it's providing access to affordable food, among other issues. So keeping rents in the range that they need to be in order to operate say a supermarket is important. So I do think it falls within the realm of local municipalities to pay attention to those items and make that a part of their overall economic development strategy, that they are providing basic needs to people, namely food, and that those stores, whether they're community run or fall into the conventional marketplace, need to be affordable.
Yeah. I think something kind of getting at what you were saying was that, the policy reflects our values. So if we don't value making sure that, there's affordable housing and making sure that there's access to food, it goes back to what we value.
Yeah, I mean, McDonald's doesn't worry about how much it has to pay for rent. Unfortunately, they'll go in no matter what. But I think somebody else is going to have to pay attention to that, particularly if it's the community trying to solve its own problems.
Yeah. Okay, going on to another question. And Tamara, I will let you know there are many requests in the chat for the link to your website. So we have posted that in the chat for people to get access. Okay. This viewer said, some years ago, while working on a multicultural assignment with a major car brand, I pushed them to install grow containers in food deserts and film it for content. The brand balked, saying fixing the problems of these communities was not their job. Do you have any recommendations for how we can mobilize brands to use their money to improve communities? Tamara, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I'll make an attempt.
Great.
So part of my training and experience is working at Commerce and HHS right out of grad school, doing MBA work and public health work in Boston. And it was at a time where social enterprise was not as mainstream, but this idea of thinking through a triple bottom line approach of people, planet, and profit, and how important that is. You know, we may see it show up in businesses as CSR, corporate social responsibility, what it means to be a corporate citizen, which I ultimately think that's what this conversation and this question speaks to. And because industry and businesses are being seen as an individual through the eyes of Congress, when we think about policy and change, we understand the role of coalitions play a critical role. And so this organization, part of understanding what it means to be a leader is who else thinks like you. We've seen top brands in the food space break off and form their own coalitions that value sustainability. And so if you believe that this issue about being able to be a corporate citizen in communities, who else thinks like this? And how do you form a coalition, a common agenda to where you advocate, be the better kind of lobbyist that we need when it comes to engaging Congress, when it comes to engaging at the state and local level, and collaborate with other organizations. So for instance, just last week a week ago when I spoke at the Food is Medicine Policy Summit, I said, look in the room, how many of us look like me? And when we think about having people have a seat at the table, how can you use your power to create doors of opportunity to ensure that voices that have been marginalized can be lock in step to give you that co-branded credibility to make the case for the changes that you need. And so to the point that was made earlier about real estate, that's important, but the ultimate question is about economic development and what are the value systems driving economic development. So at the DC level, being on the public health side of things, we see sometimes public health advocates being pitted against small business. And the question is, how can we all have a common agenda? Job creation that creates low wages and a side of diabetes is not going to help anyone, but that's what we see in our communities, that creates an obesogenic environment. And so I would implore those businesses that see the importance of this conversation of a triple bottom line of people, planet, and prosperity for all, of how do you begin forming and being a part of groups. Conscious Capitalism is one group, BALL is another group, BALLE, that are all about local economies. And being able to form new coalitions if you don't see anyone caring about the issues in your space. But we actively are. We're partnering with groups on the ground that are in the academia, health industry space, small business, economic development to reimagine food in our communities and how it is a part of our health. And so I would say also reach out to us at hello@iamwanda.org to see how can we engage and build better together.
Amazing. Okay. That was our final question in the chat. So I would just love to thank Tamara, Daryl, and Mark. Today would not have been possible without you. And I don't know about everyone on the call, but I have pages of just notes here just to continue thinking on everything that was discussed today. So a huge, huge thank you. And we look forward to having this on our YouTube channel to make sure that people can see this conversation even following today. So thank you so much.